My name is John deVadoss. Typically, when I give a presentation or a discussion on blockchain, there are two very recurring questions. The first question is, did I make money off Bitcoin? No, I did not, because I'm a techie. I'm not a trader or a speculator. And the second question is, why do I care? I mean, do people actually use blockchain systems? Is the second most often question I get asked all the time. So, quickly about myself, you're wondering why am I here? Why am I listening to this guy? I spent many years in the IT industry. Did PhD work in machine learning back in the 90s, long before it was cool. Back in the 90s, nobody cared about machine learning. Spent many years at Microsoft. I built up Microsoft Digital, essentially, which is the part of the company that's working with Fortune 500 customers and helping them with their DT efforts, much like the previous session. Built a couple of startups, did a few exits, and currently I lead a new blockchain in North America. So that's kind of why I'm here, and maybe there'll be some use for you in this session. So the second question, is anybody doing anything with blockchain? And so I figured just over the last 10 days, I would take some snapshots of news articles and perhaps just spend a couple of minutes giving you a flavor for what's going on across the industry. It can be somewhat easy to step back and say, really, this is the crypto guys doing something silly over there. Why do I care? However, if you look at this slide here, for instance, top left, 4 days ago, JP Morgan announced they're launching a coin to enable currency transfer at a global level. They're a big global corporation. Make it very easy for you to manage your currency assets across the globe. That's a non-trivial, obviously, step forward in terms of blockchain usage. If you look at Facebook, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, they acquired a blockchain startup in London, in the UK. If you look at the bottom left, HSBC. So apparently, HSBC does about $350 billion of transaction volume every day on their private blockchain infrastructure. Again, a non-trivial number, if you will. At the top right, you have the usual suspects. Microsoft is working on blockchain. Amazon is working on blockchain systems and databases. On the right, of course, Google as well. On the lower right, something very interesting. So about a week and a half ago, so Providence St. Joseph Health is a very large healthcare entity. Anybody in the room from Providence St. Joseph? I don't want to offend anybody here. All right, so you ask yourself, this is a healthcare provider, and they bought a blockchain startup working in the healthcare space, which kind of gives you a feel for what might be going on there. So again, to the question of, why do I care? Is there somebody out there doing something relevant or useful? There are a lot of people out there right now. This to me feels like the cloud back in 2006 or circa 2007. Talk about public cloud, private cloud. We were very worried about security. Can I really put my stuff on the cloud? What happens if there is a compromise? About hybrid clouds. This feels very much like that stage in terms of blockchain platforms. So again, I want to give you a flavor. So, all right, so after the cloud, what is next? Why do I have this slide? So if you step back and look at the pendulum of computing, and I began my career in the early 90s, if you look back at the pendulum of computing, up through the 70s, I would argue the focus and the attention was squarely on the mainframe, on centralized computing and computational models. And then in the 80s, somewhere in the 80s, Microsoft and the PC and IBM kind of came into the picture. And the pendulum swung slowly away from centralized to perhaps you could say more on the edge, more on the client, more towards the individual, through the early 90s. And once again, it swung back in the late, maybe say 2000s, back into the cloud computing models. So once again, a shift in terms of energy and focus and money and attention back to more of a centralized model. So I cannot predict the future. However, if you look at history, history tells us that these shifts happen periodically. And so if you ask yourself, so what is going to happen next? Will cloud be the end game? Will cloud computing be the final stage? Probably not. Most likely there will be a shift once again from the centralized cloud computing models to something a little more on the edge, perhaps decentralized. And I believe what's happening right now with the blockchain infrastructure and the blockchain platforms and dApps is the canary in the coal mine for attention, focus, and energy shifting once again away from the centralized model to more of a decentralized model. So what does it mean to be decentralized? There are probably two perspectives, broadly. One is more of a technical perspective, which is in a decentralized system, in a truly decentralized system, you would expect there to be no single choke point in the app or the network that could be attacked, which would lead to the system obviously being compromised. There is also an organizational, or you could say more of maybe a social dimension as well, in that there is no single person or entity that could be compelled to compromise the system. So when we talk about decentralization, there is very clearly, like you all know, a technology perspective, but there is very much an organizational perspective as well. I want to step back and sort of give you my own journey in terms of how for me, this blockchain space really came into the picture. Like I said, I'm not a trader, I'm not a speculator. I did not buy Bitcoin back in the early days. The first time around I saw blockchain was probably about, 7, 8 years ago. And my first reaction was, look, this is about cryptocurrencies and the dark web and such. And I'm a techie, so I stepped back. I said, this is not relevant to me, of no interest. The second time, when I went back in, I said, okay, you know what? This looks like a database. And I spent a lot of time with SQL databases. This looks like a database. It's a ledger, but obviously it's not a centralized ledger. It's more of a decentralized ledger, but still it's a database. And why would I want to go look at another database? I mean, I know SQL, I know how to build these apps, to design ER diagrams and so on. I grew up, obviously, with SQL in the 90s, right? So it wasn't interesting. What was the big idea, the big aha about a database or a ledger? The third time around was about 2 years ago. I was working on my second startup, and I happened to delve deep into the blockchain world. And what I discovered, what was the big aha for me, was that in the world of blockchains, blockchain platforms, yes, there is a crypto basis. The underlying basis is based on cryptography and secure protocols. Yes, there is a ledger, a database. It is decentralized. But what is more is every node in a blockchain platform actually has a virtual machine. And so probably you're thinking, well, if there's a VM, it's a platform. It's an app platform. And that to me was personally my own journey, the big aha, when I said, hang on, this is not a crypto perspective. This is no more a database perspective. It's an app platform perspective. And for me, as an app developer, as an IT person, as a platform guy, that's when there was the very big aha. And I said, look, I've been stupid about this. I thought I was very smart in terms of being able to comprehend and sort of put the pieces together. But clearly, I was just stuck in my own little box. I did not know what I did not know. And that was really the big aha when I said, look, there is a new platform pattern here. When you have a platform, you have apps, you have tools, you have management, security, and so on and so forth. And that is what I would ask you to think about. When you look at the blockchain world, see it as an application platform. So just a quick walk through. The crypto perspective. So clearly, obviously, it's and again, this is probably Wikipedia summarized, but you will have the slides. You don't have to, but I want to just give you a quick summary, right? So crypto, typically digitized assets. Are the slides readable? Are the colors off? If so, I apologize. Thank you. So clearly, an asset that's digitized, working as a medium of exchange that's based on very strong cryptography to secure transactions and the transfer of assets. This is the cryptographic base for blockchain platforms. And of course, you typically have a ledger that is distributed, which acts as the underlying infrastructure or the plumbing. So the next stage is, okay, so we agree. The second level is the DLT, the so-called DLT, the decentralized or distributed ledger technology, also called a shared ledger, is a consensus of replicated, shared, and synchronized data across multiple sites, multiple geographies or countries, and so on and so forth. And there is no centralized administrator. There is no centralized data storage. And I was in this phase probably about, what, two and a half years ago. There was nothing, there was no big deal, no big aha, it's a database. Then you come on to, okay, there was this guy called Vitalik Buterin. Vitalik, probably you heard the name. Vitalik was the founder of Ethereum. So Ethereum was different because Vitalik said, look, if you look at Bitcoin, think of Bitcoin as a single scenario platform or a single use case platform. What you could do was obviously transfer and you could store Bitcoin and you could obviously have transactions. It was a single use case stack. What Vitalik did with Ethereum was to add this virtual machine to every node. And then you have what's called a DApp platform, or a decentralized application platform. An app run by many users, obviously on a D network with a trustless protocol. And obviously, the goal is to try to avoid or minimize any single point of failure. The way I would ask you to think about the architecture conceptually is much like, we've all built client-server apps. We've built SOA systems and architectures. We've built, obviously, web apps and global class, global scale websites and services. So very similar. You obviously have storage. It is decentralized. You obviously have communications. It's decentralized. You obviously have identity, also decentralized. Then you have what's called contracts, smart contracts, which is really a fancy name. It's a marketing name for the code that runs on these VMs in the nodes. I'm not certain who actually chose to use the term smart contracts. I believe it goes back to the early 90s in terms of, again, cryptography. But the phrase smart contract really means is code, application level code, running on every node because there is a VM in the infrastructure. So then, bringing all this together is the notion of a DApp, which is a decentralized app. And you could run them on a custom client app. There are also browser add-ons. For example, if you use Brave or Firefox, there are add-ons like, for example, MetaMask, where as opposed to having a custom client, you can actually engage with the DApp platform like Ethereum or Neo and so on, using a browser add-on, like, for example, MetaMask. That's really the synopsis, if you will. There is a new platform at play. There are new, obviously, when there is a platform, there are new apps. There are new apps, meaning there are clearly new app patterns. And what we've seen thus far is a few of those patterns. We've seen the single use case, a la Bitcoin, single use case stack and application. We've seen folks in terms of JP Morgan, what's called a stable coin. We've seen, obviously, healthcare. We've seen the big platform players, Amazon, obviously, Google, and so on, investing, building these stacks, platforms, and tools. So I want to just pause here for a few minutes. I've been talking for about perhaps maybe 10, 12 minutes. I want to just pause and stop here. Maybe questions, comments? Maybe you agree, disagree. Yes, sir. What is it? Why do you care? So what do I do with it? Okay, very good. Just hold on for a second. I have a few more slides. It's a very relevant question, obviously, yes? Yes, absolutely. It's a great question. So yes, think of blockchain platforms as application platforms. The way we think about cloud platforms, cloud stacks, as containers or apps, going back obviously to websites and web services, all the way through now to serverless Lambda and Azure functions. Please do think of blockchain platforms as application platforms. We are seeing emerging app patterns, but we're too early in this game, in this phase, to truly understand all of the different kind of app patterns.
Thanks. So yeah, it's well known that public blockchain transaction rate is extremely low. If I have a private blockchain, then a lot of the advantages that you have with the cryptographically secure thing kind of go away. It's like, well, why not just use a database?
Yeah.
So yeah. I'll be interested in your...
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're saying, okay, so public blockchains, there is this perception and reality about the volume and the latency of these transactions. And if I'm going to use a private blockchain, then what's the point anyway? I could just use Oracle and be done with it, right? So it's a great question. Hold on, I have a slide. So in terms of why dApps, and obviously why do I care about public versus private as well? Any other comments about the way I just talk about the journey in terms of the shift in the platforms? Otherwise, I'll keep moving on. Okay, yes, sir.
Are you going to talk about the consensus issue?
I will, absolutely, yes. Great question. Okay. I will talk about the consensus issue as well. And certainly we can have a good discussion
that's
if you like.
That's a performance discussion.
That's absolutely, yes, that's absolutely. So we have what is the advantage? There's the consensus question, and then public versus private. So let's keep moving on. So dApps in the enterprise. So why is there this early interest? Why are people looking at this? And by the way, in the enterprise space, from what I've seen thus far, it's mostly pilots and proof of concepts. The big players, obviously you've seen Morgan and Providence and so on, are building and deploying these systems. But at the mainstream enterprise level, I'm seeing a lot of pilot projects, POCs. Executives at the business level, I think, are struggling to comprehend the business value, the ROI. However, at the same time, there is also a concern about being left behind. And so the compromise is, let's go do a pilot. Let's go do a POC. Let's see if we can understand what's going on. For example, JP Morgan, I believe Mr. Demon was the CEO of JP Morgan, 2 years ago was publicly scathingly critical of Bitcoin and blockchain, 2 years ago. Last year, he softened his view. And then a month ago, he announced Morgan Coin. And probably there is some positioning in the market in terms of not giving out, obviously, your strategy, possibly. Possibly there is some element of learning and journey around, obviously, for him to understand what's going on. But that's what I'm seeing. The enterprise mainstream is not quite there, which is a good point in time, because clearly there is opportunity and there is potential for us to be able to influence, to create value. So a lot of pilots. Almost any enterprise customer I'm talking to right now, there is at least 1 or 2 pilot projects inside the organization. So why? What is it about dApps that actually maybe help me in terms of the benefits? There are very clearly technology and technical benefits, but I would not discount the organizational benefits as well. SOA, if you look back at SOA, and I've written a couple of books on SOA, by the way, back in the early 2000s. So my passion for service-based architectures was the hope that not only was it about technology advancement, but also economic change. What I learned to my own detriment is that SOA and even microservices have still remained as a technology or a technical advance. Things like Coase's law and such in terms of transaction costs. SOA has not done much in that context. But this particular platform shift promises that thus far, and we shall see, thus far, that not only is there a technology shift, there is also an economic model shift. So in terms of the benefits, the early benefits, transparency. Because there is an audit trail that is cryptographically secure, there is very clear transparency of the log. So for example, Amazon has QLDB, which is their own in-house ledger. Now, in some sense, it's almost pointless to use something like QLDB with Amazon because as the provider, as the controlling authority, if they choose to, they could do all kinds of things with the log, even cryptographically, because obviously the keys are there. But if you truly have a decentralized blockchain infrastructure, the fact that you have this basis on cryptography gives you transparency, which is based on math, meaning there is no way around it. A second one, in terms of automation, there is a lot of focus on contracts, not just smart contracts, but contracts in the sense of you have multiple endpoints, and being able to use these dApps or smart contracts to be able to automate, and very precisely based on mathematical cryptographic protocols, to be able to validate and to guarantee execution. Autonomy. And this is where the line between technology and, to your question, sir, technical advantages, because people often ask me, so I'm a solution architect, which I am as well. So why would I want to go away from a centralized model, which gives me plenty of benefits, to a decentralized model? And my answer is, at this point in time, purely from a technical perspective, there may not be for your scenario. There may not be. A centralized pattern may be the most optimal technical pattern, quite possibly. However, if you step back and look at the overall, the culture of the organization, the systems, for example, as a consortium, if you're working as part of a consortium and you have multiple entities, multiple organizations, perhaps there is value in this autonomy, in not having a centralized decision-making body. Think of a private supply chain or an exchange, and being able to have this level of transparency, automation, and autonomy without being at the behest of a centralized entity or an organization. There are very clearly benefits there as well. Security, obviously, the fundamentals, the crypto fundamentals give us a very high level. People say, in math, we trust. If you trust in math, then clearly the blockchain infrastructure is something that then ergo, you would trust the underlying infrastructure. Accountability. Once again, having contracts across the endpoints, across the entities, the participants, and being able to, again, validate, verify, execute, guarantee the execution. So some perspectives in terms of thinking about dApps. So I would say, from a purely, as a solutions architect, depending on the domain and the scenario, you may or may not, because sometimes life is simpler in the central world. It's much simpler. There are fewer moving parts. We all know, in the enterprise space, the happy path is always happy. It's only when we go off the happy path that life gets interesting, right? And so we want to minimize moving parts, minimize, obviously, the need to stray off the happy path. And so centralized models, I'm not here to tell you that you should have to think about shifting, no. Much like the mainframe, the PC, the cloud, it's about coexistence. But the shift, the focus will shift, and the energy will shift. So some possible use cases. Again, I will not drain the whole slide. We could talk for a long time, but I want to just give you a flavor of what I'm seeing, what's going on. Very clearly, banking and FinServ is very much a hotspot. If you are in the banking space or FinServ or insurance, would strongly recommend you take a look, perhaps embark on a proof of or a pilot. This particular domain is extremely, extremely prolific in terms of the opportunity and the work going on. Things like stable coins, Ripple, you probably heard of Ripple. Anybody heard of Ripple here? We all know, yes, there you go. We all know Swift, and Ripple is competing with Swift at this point. Swift's getting worried, obviously for good reasons. If anything, the good thing is Ripple is pushing Swift to have to innovate rapidly because they've been quite comfortable. So Ripple is something to watch. Blockchains like Stellar, in terms of money transfer, in terms of exchange. By the way, I'll give you another example. I'll come back to the slide. So Facebook has WhatsApp. WhatsApp is obviously very, very popular, but especially more so in Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and such, where it's almost pervasive. You have a huge number of unbanked individuals, people without accounts. And so when you have immigrants, you have People who work in foreign countries, they remit back. So I believe that they're working on essentially a money remittance mechanism for WhatsApp, possibly, I'm speculating here, possibly using a Facebook stablecoin. And you can think about the possibilities. The middlemen today, or I should be careful, the middle people in terms of transactions who are in the middle of money transfers and remittances and such, obviously then have to ask themselves, what is the value I provide? If truly something like WhatsApp, at the push of a button, I'm able to transfer across countries, across continents. So back to this one, finance once again, supply chain. So I think you had talked about the lettuce issue, and we won't name the company, the organization, but in terms of tracking food items, obviously you can think of pharma in terms of drugs and the components of drugs, being able to have the audit trail, being able to validate, being able to regulate. But also the flip side is in that for food items, being able to guarantee and say, look, this particular tea was grown in a certain way in a certain part of the world, and it obviously has a higher cachet value. So being able to guarantee to the buyer that the process of getting the tea from maybe somewhere in northern Himalayas back to Seattle is actually legally verifiable. Because today, it's almost very difficult, if not impossible, to validate, to guarantee across the supply chain. Public sector, so things like identity. So if you look at the UN, United Nations, or the European Union, in terms of being able to provide identities, being able to then enable services, seeing a lot of interest in these public sector organizations, in particular in Europe right now, in particular across Europe. So check out what the EU has been doing in Switzerland with respect to the infrastructure. Energy, real estate. So things like being able to fractionalize assets like real estate and then have the ownership be democratized. So there could be, for example, I'll pick an edge case scenario, just pick an example. There's probably a condo somewhere in Johannesburg, South Africa. You could basically have the owners have fractional ownership of the condominium and be living in Russia and China and maybe the UK and New Zealand. And because we have the underlying infrastructure, what's called often a security token, STO, you're able to then provide a level of asset digitization and enabling new economic scenarios that today are very difficult, if not impossible, in terms of enabling, let alone enforcing. In economics, there's a quote I like a lot. They say that to comprehend a school of economics, you have to know what happened before it. To understand Keynes, you have to know about the Depression, the Great Depression. To comprehend Marx, you have to understand what was happening with respect to labor before his time. To understand what's happening with QE right now and all this, obviously, we look to the Great Recession. The same way, as we look at economic models, there is talk about things like UBI, basically universal, income guarantees and such. So we are seeing across the number 4, the government space, and certainly, I would say across the list, a lot of interest, a lot of potential. I can't see the clock, so I have no idea what time I have. So if it was 15 minutes, all right, I'll keep going fast. Thank you. And we'll come back and maybe explain some more questions. So three big patterns: public blockchains. Bitcoin is a public blockchain. Private, being able to host the blockchain. So for example, you have a supply chain scenario. You could host Ethereum or Neo, my platform, inside your organization across a variety of nodes. And then consortium. This is a very interesting scenario where you have multiple entities legally working together, and they want to have a stable basis, infrastructure to enable this cooperation. They don't want to use a public blockchain, nor is it solely private. So I would say 3 broad recurring patterns in terms of, so public, obviously, there are challenges because you obviously have everything out there in the public, and you might now want to share, as you know, with the blockchain platform, all the transactions, or at least the log, is publicly viewable. Not the contents, but certainly the log. And very clearly, for many enterprise scenarios, you will not want to have it publicly viewable. Private is completely closed. You could say, why do I care about private? Well, because you have a certain level of verifiable auditing and the transaction log, which is not at the behest of a single player. Now, currently, for the most part, you look at consortia, there is probably one player in the middle who has the control and is able to ensure that there is cooperation, and obviously, maybe they're the big buyer in the supply chain. But this gives every participant the ability in terms of working together, in terms of the visibility, in terms of the validity, and lastly, the consortium as well. We talk about consensus algorithms. There was a question about consensus. So this is something that most folks do not know. There are a variety of these algorithms. Why do we care? Because when you have multiple entities, multiple nodes, multiple systems, how do they come to some agreement, i.e. consensus, on a transaction being committed or not? Back in the early days, if you remember two-phase commit, right? Two-phase commit is an algorithm for consensus. A simplified algorithm for consensus. So you take two-phase commit and you expand it and you say, look, I have 16 entities. How do they come to some agreement, some consensus on, is this a valid transaction or do we roll it back? And that's where these things come in. So there are broadly about, I would say, 3 categories of these algorithms. One is called POW, or proof of work, like Bitcoin. And the way these work is basically, depending on how much computational power you have, you can solve these cryptographic puzzles, and that gives you the power, the ability to have a role to say in committing or rolling back a transaction. But there's a very big problem here, 2 big problems. Proof of work, because of the amount of energy, of electricity and power being used, is exorbitantly expensive. That's a bigger problem. Proof of work has what is called probabilistic finality, meaning that there is always the probability that the chain might be forked. There is a main chain, and you have a fork, maybe another fork, Bitcoin, Bitcoin Classic, Bitcoin Cash. Those are the forks. So proof of work might work for possibly Bitcoin or some dark web scenarios. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. A fork is basically where, yes, if you have the ability to control, let's say 51% of the computational capacity, you could actually determine the roadmap for the chain. Because you could actually, you could actually make it go down a different path. Exactly. So previously committed blocks, obviously, up to a point, right? Because when you say a fork, it doesn't mean there is a reset. There is no reset of the chain. What it means is, beyond a certain point, subsequent blocks, a fork obviously means that, so let's say, how do I say it? After about, pick a number, 12, 14 hours, maybe 2 days, you have enough commits in terms of the chain where subsequently the fork would happen only for the recent window of time. You cannot go back and completely have the whole thing. That's correct. But the core issue is that something that is probabilistically final does not quite work for enterprise scenarios. Because you can have a supply chain-based blockchain which says, well, perhaps this might actually not be in the final chain. That's a big issue with proof of work, right? Which often, I speak to about 10 people, 7 or 8 are not familiar with this notion that there are different algorithms and there are pros and cons. I would say, in my opinion, using something like proof of work for an enterprise scenario would be absolutely a dead end, would just be a total oxymoron, right? And this is often why there are perceptions about the usage and the scenarios and the patterns. There is what's called proof of stake, which is basically not about computation, but about staking your assets. If you have enough Ethereum or enough Neo or enough Bitcoin, you can stake this asset and say, look, I'm going to bet that this is the chain, the final chain. What's called economic finality. Once again, not quite satisfying for an enterprise scenario, not acceptable from an SLA perspective. So, for example, at Neo, what we do is, I will take you back to your computer science days. We're probably mostly all, at some point, taken the algorithms class. You probably remember the Byzantine generals algorithm, or the Byzantine generals problem of a city and 6, 7, or 8 generals. I'm seeing a lot of smiles. People remember the algorithm, right? Very similar problem. You have, let's say, 6 generals. They have a plan to attack a city. They have to exchange messages. They could lose their messages. The messenger could be shot, could be compromised, could be a traitor. Some generals could be traitors. And so what we are seeing is an emergence of a new class of algorithms for consensus based on BFT. So NEO, what I work on, uses BFT. And so for most of you, I would say, as you look at the blockchain infrastructure, look at BFT-based algorithms for consensus. POW and POS probably most likely will be a waste of time for you in terms of your own focus and interest. Next thing, so what is not so apparent is, depending on the stack or the platform you use, like for example, Ethereum, they have their own custom languages and frameworks and so on, which makes it quite expensive in terms of pilots or proof of concepts or building these apps. Other platforms like, for example, NEO, what I work on, NEO actually uses the .NET Common Language Runtime as the basis, which means that your team could write smart contracts in JavaScript, Visual Basic if you want to, or C Sharp or Go or Python. And so in terms of these pilots, look for the barrier to entry. Because if you just jump into a stack, it might have its own investment in terms of languages and runtimes and tooling and frameworks. The last thing I want to say is, again, back to the pendulum. There's a few takeaways. One is that it's about a shift from centralized to decentralized. There is no dogma. There cannot be dogma. There is a place for both. But there is an emerging class of these application platforms which are decentralized. Let's use them. They will not displace existing platforms and stacks, but there is a place and a time for them. Second, the blockchain infrastructure. If you look at the algorithms, it's actually computer science. This is just CS 201 and 301. And if you had a long weekend free, I would say please go take a look, delve into it, look at some of the code bases. It's CS 201, 301. It is the algos, like the Byzantine algorithm. We've all probably, 10, 15, 20 years ago, we did these things. We solved these problems. There's nothing new under the sun here. The last thing is, personally, what I see as the potential is that, you look at us as a nation or even as a world, in terms of inequality, significant levels of inequality, which I think is not going to be sustainable. We have to have new ways in terms of how we work, new ways of enabling economic incentives, possibly things like basic income and so on. We look at the economic fundamentals. Obviously, I think at this point we're all Keynesians, or maybe extreme Keynesians. We have to go back and think about how we ensure some level of equity and some level of a basis for us as human beings, as citizens. And lastly, technology. So I would say seeing blockchain platforms as a purely technical stack only gives you one perspective. The scenarios right now we are seeing have impact in terms of economic basis, in terms of organizational culture and systems. I'll pause right there. Maybe we have some time for a couple of questions perhaps. And yeah, I know it's late in the evening. I know it's probably a long day. You're probably tired and bored and so on. But my email, by the way, is John. You can always send me. Yes, sir. Keep going. I'll give you my email.
I don't have a question. I just want to add to one of your slides a little bit. The use case is gaming.
Yes.
It's getting a lot
absolutely.
of traction.
Yes, you're right.
And then you kind of get at it like through the other bullets, but smart cities are an ontology, which is
yes.
I'm familiar with NEO.
That's right. You're right. So you're familiar with space. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Absolutely right. Gaming is huge.
And then to give you a concrete example of where that might be, that kind of work is going on, like in a real world use case, Barcelona has got a program to kind of remake the city and the services it offers to the citizens of the city through public permissionless blockchain.
I see. Thank you.
And so there's a real interesting set of work going on in Barcelona right now around that smart city concept. And
I'll go look it up. Thank you. Yep. And you're right. Gaming is a huge scenario. You say, and I'll pause some questions, but if not, I'll keep talking. But gaming, because obviously, we are reinventing how we live and talk and communicate and play in the gaming world. Any surprises, any questions, so maybe quickly, so to a question of why would I care as a technologist? Maybe you don't. As a purely technology play, possibly not. Maybe the world is simpler in a centralized pattern. Public versus private. There is something called layer 2 solutions, basically, as a hybrid. So it's not just an absolute public or private. In a public chain, you can have what's called a layer 2 subchain. And so the layer 2 is private to you. It is visible only to you. And so you can get the best. It's almost like, it's funny, it's like the hybrid cloud, right? Back in the days when it was very big, right? You could actually take a public chain and have a layer 2 solution, which gives you the best of both worlds. But consensus, please take a look. These are just fundamental CS algorithms, but be very cautious about things like POW and POS because they might work for Bitcoin, but certainly for the enterprise. I'm an enterprise guy, I'm an IT guy. For the enterprise, the IT space, BFT-based variants are probably the most relevant, the most applicable protocols. Maybe one last question, otherwise, if not, I want to thank you again for being, is there a question, sir? No. Stellar is a BFT-based blockchain platform, a variant of BFT. Ripple also has a variant of this in some sense. Not certain about that one. Not certain about it. Let's take a look. But I'd say about a small number of these chains right now. All right, so thank you. It's been a long day. I hope there was some use, maybe some value in this, maybe some takeaways. My email is here. Please, you can always reach out to me. I want to thank you again and have a good evening. Thank you.